The storm tasted like iron and burned pine. Snow sifted through the boughs of the old god's tree and took root in the grooves of its bark like 1,000 tiny bones laid carefully to rest. Jon stood beneath the bleeding leaves and listened to the world pull itself tight. The night was a knot. Wind worried it. Breath showed over the water of the pool and drifted apart like ghosts unwilling to be named. He had not slept. A man could sleep before a battle with ordinary men. He could bundle fear in his blankets and pretend he was only cold. But this was a night that swallowed fires. The pale blue of the storm was fed by something older than weather, a will that scraped sound from the air and left it thin. He felt it in his ribs as an ache. Ghost lay curled at his boots, one eye open, one eye closed. When Jon's gloved hand found the fur at the direwolf's neck, the heat made him remember the stables at Winterfell in his boyhood. Straw that had matted down and left a sweet rot in the corners, the sing of fat on the cook fires, his father's gauntlet hand on his shoulder. The past had a way of stepping from the shadows when you least wanted it, or when you most did. A footfall behind him. The old snow creaked. "They're looking for you," Theon said from the gate, his breath making him look briefly like a smoking candle. "Then let them look," Jon answered, though there was no heat in it. He turned. Theon's hair was crusted white, the tip of his nose raw and angry. Behind him, the Ironborn held their spears and failed to look unconcerned. Bran sat in his chair a little distance from the tree, quiet as a star that had forgotten it ever blazed. His eyes were on the water that rippled faintly as flakes struck and melted. Jon never knew whether Bran was seeing the pool or seeing through it into something older and larger. It felt wrong to ask, as if he were interrupting a prayer he didn't understand. "Do you remember?" Bran said without looking up. "When we would race to climb the broken tower? You always let me win when we were near the top." "I didn't let you," Jon said. The words came out fond, which he had not intended. "You were quicker and I was heavier, and I liked watching you proud of yourself." Bran blinked and finally took him in, the way a hawk took in the shape of a field it had flown over 1,000 times and knew again from a different wind. "You hear them, don't you? The dead. The trees." Bran's voice did not rise. It never did now. "In your dreams, you hear them whispering their slow names. And the wings." Jon did not nod, and he did not deny it. The dreams had grown thick as the snows since he'd returned to Winterfell. At first they were only scents, a hearthstone interlaced with pitch, the tender musk of scales when warmed by sun, the salted wet of high clouds torn by something large and living. Dreams without pictures. Then the pictures came. He was behind green eyes in the night, their lids heavy with sleep that was not human sleep. When they opened, the world sharpened. Heat bloomed in threads that ran through everything. In the bellies of men, in the friction of leather, in the blood of horses, in the core of stones. The cold was a shape too. It was a wisp that killed color, a bite that turned heat brittle, a noise like a needle running across slate. And he had known a name in those dreams, though no one spoke it. He had known it like one knows the name of a river by touching its current. Rhaegal. Bran wet his lips. "You'll have to choose where to put your body when you go." Theon shifted his weight. "He's not leaving his body anywhere without men to guard it." His tone tried to sound light as a jest but landed too heavy. "I've fewer Ironborn than I'd like." Stark. Jon met his eyes, saw there a thin wire of fear held taut. "I'll be a man in a body until we're all corpses, and will not feed them without a fight." He forced the words like logs on a weak fire. Bran said, "You can ride him if you must, but riding steals your hands and your breath. Warging steals your hands and your breath and the sleep you might need if you live." He looked down at Ghost. "He keeps your feet on the ground, even when you fly, but you cannot be in two skins at once for long." "Can I do it?" Jon asked before he could stop himself. He had never asked if he could do anything. He only ever did and suffered the tally later. Bran was quiet for a full 10 heartbeats. At first Jon thought he had vanished into some sight he alone could see. Then the boy said, "You can, if you're willing to be less yourself." "Less myself." "There's a voice inside you that says your name when no one else is speaking." You'll need to put that voice in another mouth. A mouth of fangs. Ghost's ears pricked to some sound Jon could not hear. The direwolf rose and trotted to Bran's wheels, pressing his shoulder against them. The white fur took on a blush under the tree's red leaves. There were other sounds now. The shuffle of men arranging themselves into lines that did not want to be lines. The dull thunk of dragonglass blades settling on belt hooks and into scabbards. The distant shrugging roar of vast wings beating once, twice, and then folding into the night's shed. Drogon, Rhaegal, Dany would be with them. She liked sky better than words, and Jon could not fault her that. The cold air stirred. The storm heaved, sulked, paused, felt suddenly as if the wind were listening. "Tell the men to be ready," Jon told Theon, "and tell them if I fall, the last thing they'll hear is me swearing at them to hold the line." Theon's grin showed raw places where a man had been flayed down to something like courage. I've been sworn at by you before." He called to his men and they went. Jon walked to Bran's side and crouched. "If I'm less myself," he said, "bring me back." "If you are less yourself, you might not want to come back," Bran said, and now there was something like sorrow in the evenness. "But I will try." Jon squeezed the boy's shoulder. "Thank you." He found Dany in the dark yard by luck or fate. It was a dim bowl set into a hill of voices and shivering armor. Torches guttered madly in the wind, frustrated things that grew bright and weak and bright again. All the colors were wrong. The storm made them that way. Men had the look of fish under ice, eyes too large, mouths framed by cold. She stood with her head tipped back, hair unbound, her face wet with snow that did not seem to feel cold on her. Drogon crouched beyond. His mass made a hill of scales and iron-scented breath. Rhaegal watched from the lower wall with his head swinging faintly like a bell in a strong draft. Jon felt the glance as a touch on the back of his neck. "He answers you in your sleep," Dany said. She didn't smile. There was no teasing left in her. "When you dream, he wakes. I can tell by the way he moves his tail." Jon tried to laugh and made a sound that would have embarrassed him any other day. "He answers you when you whisper in Valyrian, and only 2 days ago I learned my mother's name." She lowered her gaze to him. Something had changed in her eyes since the storm began. They were not harder. If anything, they were a shape less guarded, as if she had stopped making room for hope and decided it would have to make room for her. "I don't like the way the cold has color," she said. "It shouldn't. Nothing about this should," he said plainly. Word was spreading as quietly as a fever that dead eyes had been seen out beyond the trench where the Dothraki waited. There are rocks black and slick with oil that would ignite when touched by fire. The Unsullied stood like a wall of water that had frozen while trying to leap. Northmen in their furs muttered prayers that were more about old habits than about gods. "There's comfort in telling your fear its own name." "They want the boy," Dany said. Her gaze flicked past him toward the godswood. "They want the end of stories. Then we'll make them choke on ours." He stepped closer to Rhaegal and took the measure of that head the way a man liked to measure the jaw of a hound he hoped to keep. The dragon's pupils narrowed, and heat breathed over Jon's face. Under the scales at the angle of the jaw there were little plates of softer skin. Jon's mittened hand touched there with a reverence he did not perform for any priest. "Burn for me later," Dany told Jon, so soft he thought perhaps she had spoken only in his ear. "Fly now." He didn't answer. There were no words for the ask, and none would have done the ask justice. He climbed the last of the wall and stood before Rhaegal. Dragon eyes the color of wet jade blinked a membrane down and back up. The muscles of his chest expanded. They smelled faintly of a salt sea that had never met any northern shore. Jon closed his eyes. When he had first slipped into Ghost, it had been like falling into a clear brook on a hot day's shock, then delight, then a pure plain sense of rightness that required no explanation. This was not that. The world resisted him as if he were stepping into a hot forge before the smith had agreed to let him in. It did not say no. It did not say yes. It said, "If you are, be entirely." The first touch was teeth. His tongue went to the roof of his mouth to run over fangs that did not sit in gums like a man's. They were seated deeper, with a strength that lived in the skull. He tasted the storm not as sharpness but as texture, a million needles of raw wool combing his lips. He could count pebbles by the warmth of their faces turned down into the packed snow. He could hear men's hearts shiver faster when they saw his head turn. He could see heat, but it was not sight as his human eyes knew it. It was a second sight that put halos on bodies where life lived, a third sight that etched outlines of cold where death pooled. He opened his eyes, and there were two of him, one with a body and a sword and a scar over one eye, one with wings. Rhaegal's legs uncoiled. Snow leapt. The air took them, and for a breath the earth's claim was a memory shed like a cloak. Jon felt the wind as force, as numbers his body did without counting. He knew angles and weight shifts the way he knew when Ghost would break left on an elk. His first instinct was to fight the dragon's instinct, and the fighting created a shiver in the bones of both their bodies. The shiver eased when he ceased to insist on hands he did not have and allowed a tail to pull him instead. He found himself smiling without a mouth that could be seen. Drogon rose with them, a black torch too large to be sensible. Dany's hair streamed and her eyes found Rhaegal's for a heartbeat that was longer than a heartbeat. She lifted her hand once and then dropped it as if the cold had stung her. Jon felt Rhaegal rumble and answered with his own, a thought shaped like a growl. The storm tried to swallow them, but wings make their own weather. They rode the bad air into worse and then showed even that worse a fiercer thing. Winterfell's lights grew small and then spread like spilled coins as they were revealed and hidden by the moving snow. Far below, the Dothraki lit their blades one by one, little suns waking in the storm. Jon felt the dragon's hunger at the sight of fire, a belly hunger and a deeper kind that wanted to answer that light with its own. The first line of the dead stood beyond the trench as if the night had grown teeth. They did not shout. They did not stamp their feet or sing to keep fear from finding their toes. They simply existed in a crush of stillness, their eyes a copy of the storm's wrong color. Between them moved taller figures with the sheen of lake ice and the patience of glaciers. Jon felt Rhaegal's interest like an itch. Those the dragon thought without words. Those were things a dragon could bite and find flavor. Jon spoke to the dragon as best he could with the parts of himself that were not human. He poured into Rhaegal a picture of the trench set afire, of the dead held at bay by heat, of the patience required to guard. Rhaegal sent back a mood like stubbornness softened by the possibility of play, which in a dragon was as near to obedience as a man could ask. They banked low and let loose a ribbon of fire that the storm tore at but could not twist into nothing. Dragonglass stakes along the trench glistened. Oil slicked black and then flashed bright as if it had remembered the sun. Heat rolled over the dead and made their stillness scream without sound. He felt it in their unnatural quiet. Drogon answered with a pour of his own flame, and for a moment the world near the trench was day. Men shouted. A horn called small as a reed whistle, then steadier. The White Walkers watched from their saddlebacks of cold, their heads turning slightly as if they took note and filed the noticing away. Jon had room then to go higher. He took it. Rhaegal's wings worked in great beats that sounded through his bones. Between each beat he felt an infinite quiet where a fall could happen but did not. The quiet was a hunger too. It asked to be trusted. When they cleared another layer of cloud the world opened, and for the span of an exhale Jon forgot why he had ever wanted to be a man. The storm was an animal beneath them, a white thing with ridges and valleys and a slow ambition to eat. The moon was a smear, the stars stones under shallow water. In the far distance, where the storm's hide thinned, there was a different light. It was not fire. It made no heat. It was blue that wanted to be a blade. Viserion. Jon felt Rhaegal's rage without knowing where his own ended and the dragon's began. The anger was not red. It had the color of metal just before it turned red, a deeper thing that did not flare so much as widen. It made him heavy, and then it made him sure. He could have flown straight for that blue, and perhaps a story would have liked the boldness of it. But he felt Bran's earlier words as a hand on his shoulder. If you are, be entirely. The being required thinking as a dragon thinks. Dragons do not charge light without knowing the dark around it. He swung Rhaegal into a circle, tight as their great bodies could manage, just above the top of the storm. The air up there cut. It shaved edges off his thoughts until nothing extra remained. He put his human eyes away and looked with the other sight. He saw Winterfell as a knot of heat. He saw the trench as a wound that bled brightness. He saw, disturbingly, the crypts as a place where cold had gathered to listen. He saw the movement of Viserion below the cloud as a line of wrongness moving like a hook through cloth, ripping seams in the storm as it went. Rhaegal wanted to dive. Jon let him want it and did not do it yet. They dropped instead to a height where the gales were hands and those hands were trying to push them back to the ground. Men below raised faces and thought of old tales, not knowing whether they were the sort where heroes arrived or ghosts. Jon smelled oil, horse, fear, onion soup, the strange hard cleanness of unsullied discipline, the musk of Dothraki hair, the iron of 1,000 mouths tasting blood they hadn't yet spilled. He saw Yora ride broken-backed into the dark and then back out again, his face set like a judgment he had accepted. He saw Grey Worm stand in a place that had no wall and make one with his body. He saw Arya move along the battlements like a memory of a cat, only colder. He saw Dany turn Drogon and rise into the teeth of the wind. She moved oddly, and then he realized it was not her. It was Drogon cutting a slant that only a dragon could hold. She was a part of his long body now, less a rider than a piece of molten thought he carried. For an instant Jon knew he was seeing as she saw too, that their two flights had braided. He wanted to call to her and forgot how because he was a dragon at the moment and dragons do not call to each other with words. A blue flare ripped the storm. It sounded like glass breaking though there was no glass and the sound was all through him at once. Viserion burst from the cloud below them, mouth open, jets of cold fire working at the night as if to crush it down on the living. His wings were ragged banners. His body seethed with light that looked like sickness made luminous. Drogon swerved and climbed. Rhaegal rolled on a wingtip and the world became a blade's edge Jon balanced on. He felt the stream of blue pass under his belly, so near it tickled pain into the soft plates of skin there. He smelled it. The cold had a smell, a blankness that wanted to be a new kind of world entirely. Rhaegal screamed. The sound made bones remember they were hollow. Jon aimed that sound not at Viserion, but at the storm itself. Let it be known that there was something in this night that would not bend, not for cold and not for the absence of names. They dove. It was not bravery. It was acceptance of what a body with wings is meant to do when a rival shows its throat. Wind went past so fast it lost its voice. The snow's white became lines like threads drawn long. Jon felt Rhaegal's chest bellow in and out, fire cupped and cradled in there like the last of a king's horde. Blue moved left. He moved right. Their heat met its cold in a tearing shriek that became steam, an unseen roar of water born and gone. Viserion's head snapped. His eyes were bottomless and empty as wells the village women had long since stopped drawing from. A line of cold touched Rhaegal's shoulder and dug there briefly, sharp as the first bite of winter. Rhaegal's blood was hot as poured metal. Jon felt it and wanted to weep though he had no ducks in the skin for weeping. Instead, he fed Rhaegal a memory. Running through the pines of the Wolfswood, Ghost's breath at his side, the smell of snow before a fall. Rhaegal steadied. They banked. Drogon came up from below and through, and for an instant Drogon's tail flicked Viserion's jaw, an insult in a language dragons had presumably invented when the world was new. Below, the trench faltered. Jon saw dead piling at the burning gap and making bridges of themselves without complaint. He saw the unsullied bending like reeds, then straightening again. He saw Davos on the wall with a torch in one hand and his other hand useless but lifted anyway as if it remembered it once had fingers to command fire too. Now, Jon told nobody and told Rhaegal, and they dropped to the quivering line and poured flame clean across the bodies that had become a siege ladder. Some died screaming with no voice and some did not notice at all. The overhot stink surged up at them. Of all the smells of battle Jon had learned, the smell of burning dead would be the one he would never speak of. Rhaegal's shoulder stung. The place where the cold had kissed him refused to be warm again. Jon felt the worry begin in Rhaegal like a small, sharp thing gnawing. He quieted it with more memories. Arya's laughter when she had once beaten him with a stick. Sansa's face as a girl when she'd seen lemon cakes and believed the world would be kind to her forever. His father's silence around the supper table, a silence that had meant security more than fear. He did not know if dragons took comfort in such things, but Rhaegal's bones told him yes. The boy in the gods would existed as a pull on his thoughts. It was like being tied by a narrow red thread that ran through the storm and through the heart and through the tree. Jon let it anchor him. He let it also instruct him. The dead would keep coming. The pale riders would keep measuring. The true cold would only show itself when it chose to, and then only because it wanted to be seen. He angled Rhaegal toward the godswood and felt the dragon's mild resistance. That was a place with small spaces and leaves and not much sky. He sked it anyway and sweetened the ask with the promise of a bite if anything there deserved biting. They came low over the walls, both dragons' bellies nearly brushing stones rhymed with hoarfrost. Men ducked with shouts that turned to laughter that had no joy. Jon saw Theon's narrow face upturned, pale as any fish belly but steady. His men arrayed like a threadbare cloak around Bran. Ghost paced the line with his silence that was its own courage. When Rhaegal's shadow passed over the heart tree, Bran looked up. Jon could not say how he knew, with a dragon's eyes and his own human eyes both engaged, that Bran was looking at him instead of merely at a moving dark. But he knew. Bran nodded once, small enough. Something else moved. In the spaces between flakes, in the angles of the branches, in the breath of men just taken and not yet let go, the temperature dropped a degree that made the soul flinch. The storm hushed, like a crowd that had been loud, and then noticed the man entering the hall was the one they had been speaking of. The Night King stepped out of the clouds as if the sky had grown a man. He came on Viserion's back. He wielded nothing in his hands yet. His presence was the weapon. The blue of him intensified the blue of the dragon until both were not color but argument. He did not look like a king. He looked like an answer to a question men had not asked carefully enough when they first decided fire should belong to them. Rhaegal bristled and Jon felt his own heart speed to a beat that could not be lived with for long. Drogon reared above the godswood and Dany leaned forward, her hair a snarl of frozen silk. For the space of a blink Jon thought he could feel her fear and courage both, like two hands clasped hard around a cup that was too hot to hold and too precious to drop. Viserion opened his mouth. The world pulled in its breath to see what would come out. Jon didn't wait. He dove at an angle no man on the ground could have seen. The knight's geometry was for flyers now. He made Rhaegal's body into a blade and aimed at the place where the Night King's calm sat most exposed. The rush to the target devoured thought. There was only physics and will. Blue met green gold like a curse meeting prayer. The air cracked again. Jon had the perverse sense that the storm enjoyed the noise. He and Rhaegal curved and found a space where they could slip behind Viserion's right wing and then below, low enough that if they aired the godswood would be a spike that drank dragon blood. A shard of cold grazed his cheek. Not his cheek. Rhaegal's cheek, drawing a score that hissed. A droplet of the dragon's blood fell and hit the heart tree's surface. Steam rose in a little whirl that smelled like hot iron and sap. The tree did not complain. The tree had seen more than even this and would again if there was an again. He felt a tug then, a human thing. His body where he had left it. It was not in the godswood. He had refused to lay himself down there like an offering. He had gone instead to a sheltered space just inside the inner gate where Davos had promised to plant his tired old feet and shout at anyone who came close. Jon felt that body's weight. He felt, shockingly, a hand on one human shoulder, steadying it. He knew without seeing the hand belonged to Sam, whose sweat smelled of parchment and fear and hope. "Hold him," Davos had said when Jon first went slack, "and if his eyes roll back like a man dying, slap him like a boy misbehaving." Sam had promised to do neither and both if needed. That pull grew. Not an instruction, but a warning. You cannot be two things forever. A dragon and a man will argue eventually, and the side with teeth is very persuasive. Jon set his human self aside as if it were a sword he might need again soon. He leaned into Rhaegal's body and sent the dragon his stubborn human refusal to let the world become only winter and forgetting. Rhaegal accepted it like adding a log to an already roaring fire. They rose to meet the Night King again. Viserion twisted, and the move was not a dragon's gift. It was a rider's cruelty turned to motion. The dead dragon howled, and the hole where his throat had been seethed a light that had no warmth. He spat cold, and the cold made a path the way a river cuts a valley. Drogon took it in the shoulder and screamed, and the sound broke windows below, though it came muffled through the snow. Dany clung low and kicked her heels into the scales as if the old horse commands could apply to a living mountain. Drogon rolled his bulk, and the blue slid off him, frost blooming and cracking along the plates of his hide. Jon thrust Rhaegal between them and the next line of blue. He knew Dany would curse him for that later if there was a later, and he would accept the curses as a salve. The cold struck Rhaegal full on. The world turned white, that hurt to look at. For a heartbeat Jon was lost. Not to death, but to a blankness where he could not remember which mouth was his. A memory saved him. Not a great one. Not a war. Arya as a little thing pushing her hair out of her eyes with the back of her wrist. The ordinary tenderness of it tugged him back into being a person and a dragon in the same instant. Rhaegal bucked and spat fire, a tight rope of it that tied a knot in the air between the cold and the heat. The knot exploded in a steaming roar. Shards of ice that were not ice, that had never been water, fell in glittering needles into the godswood and rang off blades and helms. The Night King smiled. The expression was thinner than a blade of grass and twice as sharp. He lifted his arm at last. Below, men died. Jon was aware of it in the way he was aware 1,000 candles were being blown out in the storm. One by one, little puffs that had all thought they might last longer. He could not go to them. He could only make the thing in front of him less certain of victory. He aimed for the rider and did not plan for Viserion. The dead dragon's tail came round with a snap that would have broken a tower's neck if towers had necks. It glanced Rhaegal's injured shoulder and spun them in a lurch that knocked thought sideways. They dropped. The ground ran up at them full of sharp things. Jon fought to keep the dragon's wings from folding in a panic and to keep his own mind from crawling into some corner of Rhaegal's skull to hide. They opened one wing and then the other. The resulting wobble hurt but held. They barely cleared the Old Bailey. The snow there was packed into something like a floor by 1,000 boots that had since ceased to be attached to men. They skimmed the top of the low storage sheds and tore shingles free. The dragon's claws raked air and found only wind. Viserion came down after them, guided by a hand that did not tire. Jon felt the guidance as a wrongness in gravity. The Night King did not ride like a man. He rode as if the rules of movement were a language he had rewritten while everyone else was asleep. Jon did not lead Rhaegal away from the godswood. He led him into it. Branches struck scales with sounds like bones thrown against plates. The heart tree's limbs spread a net of red and white and shadow. Viserion followed because once a thing has decided you are prey, it will do you the honor of consistency. The dead dragon tore centuries of bark in one flailing stroke. The air filled with the smell of sap that had learned to be patient. Rhaegal twisted close to the ground. The stones of the godswood path were treacherous under snow, slick and irregular. He almost touched with one wingtip and would have broken it if he had not been two things at once. Jon drove both their bodies through the trees the way a man drives a horse through a gate with a low lintel. Teeth bared at the thought of the scrape and head ducked in defiance of it. Viserion clipped a branch and left a rib of it stuck through a torn patch of his wing. He did not notice. The Night King's blue did not glance down at the spear of wood protruding through the skin of his mount. Jon took the insult as a gift. He tightened their curve around the tree and suddenly they were behind Viserion. So close Jon could have put out a hand and touched the dead scales if he'd had a hand to put out. He had fire instead. He gave it. The gout struck Viserion's left hindquarters and burned with a hunger that was not like normal fire. Rhaegal's fury flavored it. The blue answered with blue, and the two excoriations clawed at each other and made a color that did not have a name. Snow screamed into steam between them. Branches went black and then bright and then black again. The Night King raised his arm, and Jon felt a pull like a hook thrown into his back. Not Rhaegal's back, his back, the human one. In the room near the inner gate, Sam stumbled, and Davos cursed, and men turned at the sight of Jon's body jerking like a fish on a line. The dead around Winterfell's walls shuddered. Some rose, others stopped, the blue in their eyes dimming as if confused. The pull went through those risen things, through Jon in two skins, through the tree, through the sky. It was an invitation to be something simpler. Bran's eyes turned white. He opened not his mouth, but the space behind his eyes that went back and back into roots and stone and waters that do not freeze. Jon felt a second anchor bite in deeper than the first. He heard, if hearing was the word, the voice of the wood. Not words, the sound of sap rising in spring. The creak of bough in storm that refuses to break because it belongs to a story of endurance. A whisper that said, "You may be less yourself and still be mine." The hook slackened. Jon drove Rhaegal up with a beat that made the trees bow. They cleared the god's wood, and the cold clutched at them again, furious at the lost purchase. Viserion followed, wound smoking where fire had kissed. The Night King had stopped smiling, which was nothing, but also much. On the walls, archers loosed without hope and hid enough undead eyes to make hope breathe once. Arya ran along the roofline of the great hall and then was not there, the way a memory will go when another arrives in its place. The hound stood somewhere and tried not to weep. He failed, then drew breath and did not fail. Jon climbed. The air above the storm was thin, and in that thinness the world was brutally honest. There was no room for lies when every inhale mattered. He thought of the first time he had looked out over the top of the wall and understood that only size stood between men and cold. He thought of smaller things too. Bread that didn't rise, a pair of boots that pinched, a girl's small hand in his once when she had asked if he could show her the litter of pups again. Life's ordinary tendernesses bolted themselves to him one by one until he was heavy with them and anchored against being peeled away. They turned and went for the rider. The Night King pointed at them as if choosing a cup from a table. Jon felt Rhaegal's heart squeeze once. Hard. For the briefest instant they both forgot what wings were for. Then remembered. The blue came and they slipped left. It grazed Rhaegal's ribs. Pain sang. Jon swallowed it and swallowed the sound of his own fear inside it until both were his. He did not know if he would ever find the way back to his body. He did not know if his body would still be waiting the next time he reached for it. He did not know if, should he get back inside it, there would be anything left of virtue in him after tasting what a dragon's certainty tasted like. He knew only that the world could not be allowed to end in the color of this cold. He angled up and then down in a line that would, if continued, cut the Night King in two. Rhaegal's fire banked. It pooled at the back of his throat, an ache sweet as vengeance and dangerous as grief. He held it a heartbeat longer than a dragon might have left to his own joy. He stepped inside Viserion's arc the way a swordsman steps inside a clumsy man's swing. He saw Dany coming from the other side, Drogon's teeth bared in a way that had nothing to do with hunger. Between them was the rider. The Night King turned his face toward Jon, toward Rhaegal, toward this attempt at ending him that men and trees and wolves were making together. His eyes were not curious. They were not even cruel. They were final. Now, Jon whispered into a mouth filled with fire. He let go. Fire sprang like a rope thrown by a god and knotted round the Night King's chest. It burned sheer bright. It filled the world with the taste of a forge. It made night blink. For a heartbeat, Jon felt the satisfaction that comes when the right blow finally lands, when all the pains of positioning and patience find their single-held breath. The flame poured and the rider did not scream. He did not even lean. The blue in him did not dim. It shone through the wash of fire like a star seen through thin cloud, unbothered by the heat that should have charred bones and boiled marrow. The dragon's furnace roared, and the Night King sat in it as if seated in his own hall. Rhaegal's surprise traveled through Jon in a twinge of recoil. Dragons know what their fire does to flesh and to iron and to stone. When it did not do that, the body that made it reeled. Jon held him, and in holding him held himself, and tasted the old iron of disappointment on a tongue that belonged to two. Drogon hit from the other side. Dany drove him with a ferocity that threw sparks off the edges of her will. She brought teeth and claws and a hail of flame, and if fire would not take the rider, then perhaps gravity would. Drogon's shoulder slammed Viserion's ribs. The dead dragon bucked and snarled without heat, light spilling through the rents along his neck like a lantern jar cracked. The Night King's hand opened. Frost peeled from his palm as if it were the skin of fruit. An ice lance grew there as clean as a thought. Rhaegal twisted the instant Jon felt the thought in the rider's wrist. The spear cut the air a hand's breadth from Rhaegal's left eye. It sang a high bright note as if it liked having missed and wanted to be admired for the try. It drove on and hammered a battlement tooth from Winterfell's lower curtain. Stone burst outward with a cough that sparked. Men ducked and swore and lifted their faces again into the storm because there was nowhere else to put them. Jon did not waste the time the mists had given them. He put Rhaegal where teeth and talon could make truer claims than fire had. They came in under Viserion's ragged wing, and Rhaegal's jaw closed on the meat of the dead dragon's forearm. The taste jolted through Jon. Not blood, not flesh, but a blankness with the texture of old ice scorched by salt. He hated it and bit harder. Bone, if this body still had bone in the ways he knew, gave with a gritty stiffness. Rhaegal shook. Viserion raked back with his free claw and carved 3 bright furrows along Rhaegal's neck that immediately hissed and wept steam. The smell of his own blood enraged him. The smell enraged Jon like the sight of his brother struck would have. Drogon dove low to Harry, and Dany's face bent to the work of surviving. She saw Jon for a heartbeat through a warp of snow and steam and roared wordlessly. He could not hear it with ears, but the meaning ran along the taut wire between them. He answered by remaining where he was, between her and the night's cold will. The storm pressed its weight down. It wanted all flying things humbled. Rhaegal answered with strength drawn from a memory Jon gave him. The slow, day-long pull of a sledge through new snow, 2 brothers swapping the traces between them when one flagged, neither admitting the pain in his hips. Dragons do not pull sledges, but stubbornness is a harness too. Rhaegal's wings bit more air than the storm had offered and made their own. The leather between scars trembled but held. They broke and rose and then banked again. Below, the trench's bright wound had become a line of coals choked by bodies. In places it was raw day. In others it was the memory of day. Dead poured over their dead without pause. The unsullied in their ranks shaped themselves to whatever came and broke it into pieces small enough to step over. Jorah retreated and advanced and retreated again with the grace of a man who had finally made peace with the difference between winning and buying time for others to live. Arya disappeared from the wall. The hound stood too near the flames and swallowed a tremor that wanted to drive him to his knees. Beric's voice found him, rough and patient as a hand on a mad horse's shoulder, then vanished like a rocket thrown into a gale. Somewhere a horn failed and tried again and found its voice. Rhaegal's shoulder bled where cold had kissed him earlier. The wound drank heat greedily and did not give it back. Jon laid his human stubbornness over it like a cloak and felt the dragon's pain dull to something endurable. In return, he took a thread of dragon strength back into the part of him that was only a man. The exchange was not even and could not be maintained forever. But nothing about this night had the shape of forever. That reassured him despite himself. A feeling like a temperature change came through the air. It was not with the wind. It was in the wind. The Night King had directed Viserion into a rising arc that would take him and his mount higher than the living would willingly go in such thin air. Jon felt the intent. He did not think he felt it because the Night King projected it. He thought he felt it because all creatures are bodies in a single piece of cloth, and a great violence of intention makes the weave pucker where it passes. He went up to meet it. The cold there had edges. It shaved Rhaegal's nose and thunked knuckles into Jon's thoughts. The moon was only a stain. The stars were remarks left by strangers long gone. The blue that wrapped the rider and his beast was a private noon. They came on in intersecting arcs, 2 hunting birds testing line and nerve. Rhaegal's breath built. Viserion's mouth glittered with a light that made pupils pin. Jon kept the 2 in shape in his mind. how their lines would cross, where his wings' last brave inch would carry them, how far he could ask Rhaegal to lean into death and not tumble. The Night King pitched early, and the change was wrong in the same way a sentence is wrong when it swaps subject and verb. He asked the heir to become a floor, and the heir, bankrupt, agreed. Viserion used that false floor to leap again. The blue line he vomited went long and low, a scythe. Jon took them through it as a swimmer takes a breaking wave headfirst, not up or away. The cold tore at soft places and found them viciously. Rhaegal's belly sang with pain. Jon's own intestines clenched as if someone had reached and squeezed. He carried them both through into warmer air and turned at once so the pain could find something to be used for. Pain that only sits is wasted. Pain with a task can be borne. Come, he willed, and did not mean Dany or Bran or his own abandoned body. He meant the dragon he had become a piece of. He meant the old gods whose red leaves flamed beneath the storm. He meant the wolf that matched his breath when no one else did. They fell as if they had been cut and then opened their wings a hair and turned the fall into choice. Drogon came from below again, and Jon felt relief that had the size of a prayer. Dany and Drogon opened a fountain of fire that drove Viserion to swerve not for the pain of it but for the force. The Night King remained a note held unbroken. Frost formed and broke over his skin as if warming and cooling were both beneath his dignity. The second spear grew in his hand like a thought he'd been about to think all along. He cast it not at a dragon's heart but into the place where Drogon would have to turn or fold or die. Jon knew that place because he had learned to ride with Dany, because he had watched Drogon move with her in the warm south sky where wind was an ally instead of a judge. He knew it, and he put Rhaegal's wing in that place with a brutality that felt like betrayal and was love. The spear glanced and screamed away into the dark and became someone else's doom far from here. Drogon's wing half folded, then snapped full again, and the jolt rolled through both of them. Dany hit the saddle with her chest and grunted. The ground far below echoed the small sound with an earthquake of human voices that had nothing to do with it and everything. Jon felt a tug not from the sky but from the old snow close to the ground. The pull took the shape of a man laying his palm steady on a shoulder that did not know if it wanted steadiness. Sam's breath was by Jon's human ear. "Come back," he said, not pleading, not commanding, just telling what must be done the way he might tell a friend he had to eat even if he had no appetite. Davos's oath came on the edge of the awareness like a seasoning no one had asked for and which made the dish better anyway. "Stay with us, lad," the old knight said to the body that sagged. "If you go all the way, I've no rope to haul you back." Jon did not go all the way. He took that touch as proof of the shape of his own name and pushed the dragon deeper where human names mean less. If he thought of names at all, they were the names dragons gave to mountains and to knives of wind and to blue wrongness. Something below and behind him cried out a warning in a tongue that was not a tongue. Bran was open again. The warning was not an order. It was a mapping. The gods would, the crypt, the pressure where stone would soon flower with things that had been meant to stay mute forever. Jon felt that flower begin. He felt it the way a frost line runs through a plowed field at night and the farmer knows in his bones his seedlings will be touched. His human mind skidded toward the thought of Sansa in the dark with the dead of her blood. He wrenched himself away and gave the worry to the weirwood like a debt to be collected later. The tree took it and did not break. The tree had never broken. Snow shook as if it had heard drums. The crypts whispered. The dead there were not meant for war. They were meant for remembrance. The wrong color reached them anyway, and old fingers began to twitch in the rock like roots hunting water that had been promised. Sansa stood with her back against a damp stone wall that had been carved with names worn smooth by generations of hands. Tyrion had a knife he didn't like and a look he didn't trust. Missandei had a piece of dragonglass that had been meant for the hand of a soldier and thus fit badly in hers. Varys held a torch that made his bald head an egg set to boil and said nothing and thought everything. Gilly clutched the child that was her past and her present. And little Sam buried his face in fur that was too clean for this place and shook without sound. "When," Tyrion said, because there was no if to be had. "When," Sansa answered, and kept her voice low but flat. "When they scratch through." We stab into eyes and mouths." She looked at her own weapon. A shard Jon had pressed into her palm with a look that had said "I know," and felt the knowledge of it cut into a life that had loved words more than edges. She was cold and tired and furious and noble all at once, and the bones behind the walls were waking. The first stone fell inward with a rush of old dust and a sigh like a tired man finally sitting down. A hand reached through the hole. The hand wore a ring whose symbol no living person could have remembered unless they had read too many books to be loved for it. The fingers scrabbled and found nothing and found flesh and squeezed. Sansa moved without thinking and drove the glass up into the web between the hand's tendons. The hand stuttered and released. Tyrion stabbed to the hilt into a cavernous eye that had never loved anything in life and had no right to look at his wife now. He gagged and swallowed and did not make a joke. The candles in the crypt made small, stubborn halos. The dead moved into them with a patience that had no malice and did not need it. All malice requires appetite. This was appetite burned out and replaced with a single commandment that cared nothing for stories. Above, the commandment rode a dragon. Jon pulled Rhaegal into a rising spiral that tightened until his ribs complained and then tightened again. The Night King matched the turn without effort. Viserion's torn wing left a wobble that should have been exploitable, a predictable sin in the arc that trained flyers would have used to lay a trap. It was there. It was elegant in its invitation. The Night King ignored it and made the air obey him. Jon filed the fact and hated it for the way facts require you to bow to them if you want to live. He tasted the wrong light that ran through Viserion. He wanted, suddenly and recklessly, to know if there was anything left under it that might answer to a different touch. It was a foolish desire. It was a stark desire. He made it anyway. He reached across not with words but with the sense he had been honing since boyhood when Ghost had looked at him and recognized something unpracticed but honest. The reaching did not go from mind to mind. It went from life to life, from a stored heat into a stolen one. He touched the edge of Viserion's fury and found it cold and mechanical as a mill wheel. He pressed further and felt a thing like a flake of sun caught in a snowbank, smothered, insistent by nature if not by power. A smell came to him that was not from this night at all. Salt drying on scales under a hot wind. A stable courtyard in Meereen where children had tossed offal to a young dragon and laughed at his greed. A girl's voice turned fierce to scold and then soft to soothe. He could not reach it fully. He was holding too much else. But even the brush of it made Viserion's left wing beat falter a fraction. A stutter so slight only a flyer would mark it. Drogon marked it. Dany asked for blood when she felt it and Drogon gave her that form of obedience he liked best. He drove hot teeth into Viserion's hip and tore a slab loose that steamed and stank like grief cooking. The Night King moved his hand again. No spear grew this time. He made a flattening gesture, as if smoothing a wrinkle from a tablecloth. The wind around Drogon suddenly became too obedient. It laid the great beast open to gravity's arrogance. Drogon dropped. Dany yanked his head with the reins that were more for her hands than for him, and Drogon fought the new kindness of the air until it broke and misbehaved again. They arrested the fall. They paid for it with a scream of tendon somewhere hidden under the scales. Rhaegal bellowed. The sound was not a cry but a declaration that borders existed and would be defended. He sought again the tiny shard of Viserion that had not agreed to be dead. He could find it more quickly now. It was a bright place a long way away inside a furnace made of winter. He could not put a hand over it to shelter it. He could not draw it out. He could only thumb the air near it and make it jiggle a little the way a man might make a child laugh by shaking a coin. It was enough for a breath. The dead dragon blinked, not because he remembered, but because blinking is a thing eyes do when something irritates them, and this tiny surviving spark irradiated. The blink delayed a stream of blue that had meant to peel Rhaegal's face like fruit. The delay left a seam where Drogon slipped through and raked Viserion's jaw until bone showed pale as porcelain. The Night King did not shake. The dragon under him shook and kept flying. Below, Theon looked up into the vault of the storm and saw nothing that would change what he had to be. His men's shields were nicked and the edges of their courage had worn thin in places, but they stood in a ragged crescent between Bran and whatever would come walking through the trees. The God's Wood was a room whose windows were full of snow. Ghost's pale figure slid from trunk to trunk like a blade turned sideways. The fire Theon had once loved as a boy, fire in a hall, fire in a raid, fire on a woman's hair, had here become a humble candle cupped in his chest. It was enough. He tightened his gloves and wished he had one more digit on a hand he had lost long ago, and remembered he did not need it for a spear to fly true. Bran's eyes were Bran's again. He saw Theon as if the years between them were a thing they had agreed to lay aside for a while and pick up later if they lived. "Thank you," he said. He had never said it like a prince before, and it was both improper and exactly right. "For what?" Theon asked, and let the laugh he had not been entitled to in years out of his mouth. "Making a mess of your home and then dying for it? For coming home." Bran's tone did not move, but the words did. Theon did not answer. He set his feet. He looked like a man who had found that he could put the past behind him only by placing it directly between himself and his enemy and forcing the enemy to step over it. The tremor that ran through the ground then was not made by feet. It was made by will. Snow lifted in a breath that everything took together. The leaves of the heart tree tilted as if they would bow and then refused. A line of figures detached from the blizzard at the edge of the God's Wood and walked with the speed of a song sung slow. Their eyes were winter's wounds. Their mouths had forgotten the trick of forming anything but a single word that meant all ends. The Night King was not among them. He remained above, bent purely and absolutely to the business of taking the sky away from the living. It did not matter. The ones walking wore his intention like armor. Theon took a step forward, and the men to either side of him stepped with him. He raised his spear. He did not cry anything. He did not need to, and breath was expensive. Ghost slid to the left and sank his teeth into the calf of the first thing that turned its head. Dragonglass went into throats and into eye sockets and into the seam where jaw meets ear. Men cursed in old tongues and in new. One Ironborn sobbed once like a child, remembering a story his grandmother had told, and then shut his mouth and pushed with all the weight of the sea behind him. Bran's chair sat in the snow as if it had grown there. The roots of the heart tree, half buried, made low humps like the backs of sleeping animals. Bran's hands rested on the armrests as lightly as a bird might rest on a still pond. His eyes went white and took a road into the wood so old that the road had forgotten it was one. His mouth moved, perhaps with names of rivers no map has room for anymore. The dead came on. In the crypt, a stone fell fully away and a face leaned through the gap. It was a lord of Winterfell from 9 generations ago, and the mouth that had once made judgments now gaped like a wound looking for a knife's comfort. Sansa thrust and met hard resistance and pushed until it gave. Tyrion's blade went in at a side angle and lodged in a cheekbone. He yanked and it came free with a wrong sucking. Missandei put a short, satisfied cry into the dark when her shard found a brain that was not a brain anymore and still had the decency to act like it. Varys's torch skittered as the eunuch lost and regained it. His face was a mask of unhappy competence. He held the flame high and made of himself a beacon for men who were barely men and for women who were more than anyone had ever allowed. "Eyes," he said unnecessarily now. He said it again as if the repetition itself formed a spell. Little Sam cried and then hiccuped himself quiet in terror. Gilly pulled him behind a column and glared so fiercely at a creeping hand that for a moment it seemed the hand might apologize and back away. It did not. She took her shard in both hands and did what needed doing, hissing like a kettle left too long. Jon felt all this as a pressure against his mind's edge. He could not go there. He would not leave the sky to the bad light. He would not leave Dany alone in the thin place where breath was coin. Rhaegal's wing beats were deeper now and a hair slower. His chest worked like bellows in a forge that had made too many swords. The cold had eaten patches of him that burned from the inside and would scar if they lived to wear scars. Jon shaped their line again, cut narrow through a pocket where the wind had forgotten to be cruel, rode the curl up and used it, dove to make the Night King either answer or concede. The rider chose answer. He lifted his hand once more, and this time the air itself seemed to stall. The snow hung, a billion white moths pinned by invisible sharp things. The dragon's wings labored and found the air viscous. It was a horrid, elegant cruelty, to make the medium of life yield with difficulty, as if flying through syrup flavored with grave dirt. Jon thought, not in words but in a flare of rage that had the shape of a word. No. He shoved human memory through dragon sinew and into the fog where the air had been seized. He offered not a hero's moment but a small stubborn scene. A candle refused at one window and lit in another room out of spite. A door the wind wanted to slam held ajar by a boy's scrawny shoulder because his sister's hand was on the latch. Rhaegal understood as deeply as a creature without stories can. He wrenched a wing. A rib flexed with a crunch that was not entirely graceful. They found a slipstream of disobedience and took it like thieves. Viserion plunged through the pinned snow with the terrible efficiency of a blade dropped through cloth. He careened toward the godswood in a line that promised to make of its red leaves a bouquet of embers. The Night King's eyes, if they were eyes, rested a moment on the heart tree. If there was anything like admiration in him at that old thing's refusal to be anything but itself, it did not reach his face. Jon turned Rhaegal into a crossline. The intersecting courses would tangle unless one gave. He had no intention of giving. He flattened them and pulled at the last possible instant, and their bodies flashed by each other with inches to spare. The brush of Viserion's wing was like cold rope across Rhaegal's back. Jon caught, just then, another glimpse of that flake of sun. It flickered angrily at having been touched by hope. Drogon streaked up from beneath with a roar that beat men to their knees below. Dany's hair snapped like banners. She saw where Jon had put the two dragons and drove Drogon into the seam. Teeth hit wing. Blue burst. Fire answered. Rhaegal's shoulders screamed again and then shut up like a good soldier who has been told there is more to do. The Night King's head turned with the unhurried calm of a man watching two angry dogs fight for his amusement. He made a small adjusting motion with two fingers as if setting a seal straight on a parchment. The adjusting motion reached Jon's human body like a draft. Sam's hand firmed. Davos leaned his weight on the other shoulder, not gentle, exactly right. "Stay or go, but choose," Davos said into the face that had Jon's scar. "Half measures get men killed, and I'm beyond counting at this point."
Jeune chose.
He chose to be more dragon now than man and trusted his friends to keep the empty skin breathing. The choosing was like putting his head under water and deciding not to come up until he had found what he'd gone in for. He took the pressure in his ears and bore it. Bran's gaze split sky again and poured into the trees. Jon felt the roots lift an inch inside the earth, an inch that was not an inch at all in the measurements of wood. He felt the ravens a mile off turn, as if a word had been spoken that was older than their eggs. He felt Ghost bound and rip and bound again with a joy that was terrible in this night, because joy that pure is too good for the rich and is always taxed. The White Walkers who had come into the godswood stopped and looked up. Their faces did not show worry. They do not father worry or nurse it. They simply perceived that some other force moved and took note. Theon hurled his spear. The throw was a hymn to the boy he had been when he had hit a knot in a fence post from 30 paces for his father's slow clap. It flew straight. It flew true. It punched into a walker's throat and made a sound like hail striking a frozen pond. The walker's blue went dull at the edges. Frost spidered from the wound as if trying to reinvent blood by memory. The thing fell and broke into pieces that tried briefly to wiggle and then thought better of it. The Ironborn around Theon took heart. 2 more throws took 2 more of those patient old monsters out of the world they had been trying to unmake. The last 3 kept walking, unaffected in their step, and raised thin swords that had never been forged by any man Theon had ever met. They met him not as a mob but as a school. The learning in their economy chilled the watched places at the back of his neck. He smiled, ugly and lovely, and went at them with more speed than dignity. He heard Asha's laughter as a child in the back of his skull, and Euron's curse like oil on water, and pushed both away. The back and forth in the sky had pulled higher, then lower, then higher, the way breathing pulls when the lungs are not certain they are not underwater. Jon took them down again because the work had to be done here and not in the place where the cold is clean and abstract. Here it is dirty and immediate and will stain a man's boots. He wanted the stained. He banked Rhaegal and felt something in the dragon's left shoulder complain in a serious way. The beat on that side went thin. He fed it another memory. A day on the wall with wind like teeth and training dummy after training dummy until his wrists burned and Gren had called him a madman and then joined him, and then PYP, and they had all been mad together and happier for it. The memory had more warmth than any it deserved. Rhaegal took it and made of it a pulse of strength that would last 3 beats and not 4. Jon counted them and used them like coin. They came in on Viserion's left where the wing stuttered. Drogon harried the right. The living dragon bit down. The dead dragon tried to wrench away. The rider did not move. His mouth opened, and if he had breath there was no steam to mark it. He lifted his hand and the snowfall around the gods would stopped again. Not in the sky this time but within the trees, white trapped on red leaf and dark bark like 1,000 tiny surrender flags forced to stay put. Bran spoke from his chair in a voice that sounded like wooden bells. It had no volume and all the authority in the world that remembers winters older than men and knows spring belongs to it. The white fell, could not hold when a tree tells it to move. Snow landed in the hair of the dead without making a claim. The magic there was older than the blue steels. The magic there was simply the patience of growth asserting jurisdiction. For a heartbeat, Jon loved the tree the way a man loves the mother he never knew he had. The Night King turned his head toward the heart tree again, and in that turn Jon found his line. He drove Rhaegal's muzzle not at the rider but at Viserion's eye. The lick of fire he sent was very small by dragon standards. It was deliberate. It was mean. It went straight into the jelly with a little pop that, if there had been time, would have made him gag. The dead dragon flinched. Blue sprayed crooked. The rider's hand moved in annoyance rather than alarm. But annoyance is a human thing even in an inhuman face. It was too human. It made him mortal for a rhymed instant. Drogon took that instant and made it count. He slammed his chest into Viserion's back and bore both dragon and rider down like a hawk forcing a heron into the reeds. The impact made a sound that went through the battlements into marrow. Men ducked and looked up in the same motion and did not know which had been the wiser. The 3 huge bodies tangled and tore and the earth bucked to take them. They hit the training yard and the stones there remembered being laid by hands that had planned for their descendants to fall on them in practice, not in apocalypse. Rock cracked. Frost blew outward in a ring that took warmth from men's teeth and made them feel briefly like old men spitting curses at the hearth. The dragons rolled. Dany kept her seat by force of habit and sinew. Jon had no seat to keep and kept all the same because falling when one is not actually sitting is its own skill. The Night King rose from the wreckage of old snow and broken slate and stood as if standing were not a thing that required muscles attached to bone. He looked not at the queen he had tried to unhorse nor at the dragon whose fury steamed around him. He looked at the godswood as if he had remembered an engagement he had been meaning to keep all evening. Theon saw him come. He had seen him in dreams he did not admit to, a shape on a far ridge that left a line of wrong cold in its wake. Seeing him in the flesh, if flesh it was, did not make it more sensible. It made it simple. He tightened his grip and stepped into the path that had been made by 1,000 years of men boiling meat and telling tales and kissing girls and strangling enemies under those leaves. The oath that left his mouth then was not to a king but to a boy. Jon tried to rise straight up and found that Rhaegal's left wing would not trust that movement. He rose slantwise and his shoulder scraped a crenel, and the scrape was a pain that sang and focused him. Dany pulled Drogon, bleeding, from the broken yard and made him climb again when resting would have made more mercy. Both dragons took air like draughts from a keg that was nearly empty. Go! Jon thought to Dany in a language with no nouns. Guard! He could not give her more. The air for words cost too much and he had to spend it on motion. She did not answer and he did not need her to. He saw her put Drogon between the oncoming dead and a section of wall that had softened into collapse under too much night. He saw her look over her shoulder once toward the godswood. He saw her face become more queen than woman. The Night King entered the trees. The red leaves made a crown of him he did not deserve. The 3 remaining walkers parted to let him pass and took up positions with a loyalty that had nothing to do with love. Their swords caught what light there was and made of it a cold commentary. Theon took a step. His men, those who had not yet fallen like bits of shore broken by a patient sea, braced. Ghost snarled a low, almost conversational growl. Bran watched the man come and did not watch anything else. In his eyes whole histories turned like huge slow wheels. He closed them and opened them and chose. The choice was to stay. He could have run far with ravens. He could have sunk into roots deep enough to never see snow again. He stayed in the narrow room where a boy's breath shows in the air and a knife is either in your hand or it is not. Theon moved. He was not quick the way Arya was quick. He was not deliberate the way Brienne was deliberate. He was simply all in one piece for the first time in years. He drove the spear at the center of the blue. The Night King's body turned a fraction. The point took him in the side where a man's liver would be and made a sound as if someone had tapped a very fine glass. The spearhead burst into a powder of tiny shards that hung for a heartbeat and then fell very nicely in a small ring at the Night King's feet. He looked down at them. He looked up at Theon. Jon, in the sky, wanted to kick against a door that was not in any house. The Night King reached out with one hand and touched Theon between the ribs. Not a blow, a touch. Theon's body folded around the touch as if it had been designed to do that. He dropped. The snow took his cheek and cooled it, and he smiled crookedly. His mouth full of old mistakes and brand new pride. The Ironborn shouted and made an ugly sound of grief. Ghost leapt. A walker's blade cut him along the shoulder and white fur went red. Jon drove Rhaegal down into the Godswood with no plan that could be written and every plan that ever worked. The branches struck him and made notes like thin bells, like a woman's bracelets clashing in a dance. He brought Rhaegal's weight to bear on the nearest walker and crushed it into a piece of ground that had held lovers and liars both. The creature flailed once and broke into glassy parts that did not shine. The Night King turned to face the new mess. His eyes took Rhaegal's measure. If he felt anything at the sight of Jon stretched through another living thing like thread through a needle, he did not give it the courtesy of a blink. He reached again toward the sky, as if calling a servant down. For a terrible instant Jon felt the air above Winterfell wanting to become a single blade that could be drawn and laid across the neck of Hope. Bran spoke again. Not loud, but everywhere the tree touched. It was a sound inside wood. It was a word for no that had been carved into rings when the sap was young. The blade of air wobbled and would not be a blade. Jon felt the refusal in his tongue, in his dragon gut, in his human skin abandoned near a door. He took the moment and made it reckless. He went at the Night King not with fire now, but with intent. He bent Rhaegal's neck and put the dragon's head down to the height of a man about to bite another man's face. He could die for it. The cold could take his eyes and throat. He did not think about dying. Dying is something you plan for when you believe it will buy something. He did not have time to count coin. He had only instinct and the sense that the blue wanted to be forever and therefore could not be allowed to be today. He struck. Teeth closed on empty air where a shoulder had been a blink before. The Night King stepped aside without hurry. His hand brushed Rhaegal's upper jaw as one brushes a horse's muzzle to teach it that he is master. Frost skittered along scales and tried to nest. Rhaegal's muscles rippled and threw the cold off as a dog throws river water. Much, not all. Jon's tongue numbness told him what his eyes could not see. Drogon burst over the trees and laid a low sheet of fire that left the roots steaming and the walkers' edges hissing where they met the heat. Dany leaned, eyes narrowed to slits, jaw clenched. Her heart said a name that was not a title. Jon did not hear it, but he felt his own name in the heat and almost turned to answer. He did not. The Night King lifted his arm lazily. The two remaining walkers took one step and then turned into 100. Whites poured between trunks, a tide ridiculous in trees and nonetheless competent. The Ironborn broke the first crash the way men break waves by making their bodies heavy and their feet wide. They would not break the second without a cost that would empty their pockets entirely. Arya came into the gods with the way a memory returns. All at once and utterly silent until it is the only thing you can hear. She moved from shadow to shadow without insult to any of them. Her face had the lightness of someone who had set something down that had been heavy and could now carry other heavy things because of it. Blood, hers and not, ran in a drying line along her jaw. She saw Theon on the snow and glanced toward the Night King, and the glance was not a question. It was a calculation. Bran's eyes found her and did not widen. That would have been a waste of motion. But something in the line of his mouth softened, as if a winter branch had discovered it would bend without breaking this once. The red leaves above them shivered, and a single one tore free and landed in Arya's hair. The Night King did not see her. Or he did and decided that seeing means nothing if your idea of the world's end does not include exceptions. He stepped toward Bran. His feet made no sound. He drew no weapon because he was a weapon. Jon put Rhaegal's head between that step and its intended end. He did not think of teeth and claw, he thought of bulk. He shoved the blue thing as one shoves a door that wants to be stuck. The shove landed. The Night King shifted half a pace and then simply was not where the shove had required him to be. He had not jumped. He had not ducked. He had not teleported. He had simply refused the premise. A hand closed on Jon's arm. Not the Night King's. Arya's. She had landed in the dragon's shadow and used it for proof against blue sight. She used Jon's body like a post to pivot around and drive herself forward into the thing that unmade seasons. The small knife in her hand had a hilt worn to her measure. The blade was old and meant for kings. She had another in the other hand to decoy with. She had a third that was superstition and gift and accident. She moved with them all. The Night King's hand shot up and caught her by the throat. The blue made her skin look like she had already died and come back to kill again. Her feet left the ground. She made of being lifted a choice. She dropped the knife in her right hand. She caught it with her left. She drove it down toward the hollow where a man's collarbone meets. The blade met a palm that had frozen rivers by pointing. It did not break. It did not pierce. For a heartbeat it hovered above that place of all endings and waited to learn which story it was in. Jon felt time make a noise like a tight string plucked. He drove Rhaegal's head against the Night King's arm with a sudden, savage but that used all his hatred of inevitability and all his love of the girl he had sparred with under green boughs and watched grow into a blade. The arm moved, only a little. Enough. The knife went the last small distance. The sound was not an explosion. It was an agreement being rescinded. Cracks ran through the Night King like lightning under ice. The blue in his eyes flashed in their wells and then had nowhere to go. He came apart as if someone had decided there were now more useful ways for his matter to be arranged. The wights in the gods would halted in their rush as if hearing a song end in a key they could not find. Then, one by one, 100 at a time, 1,000 a breath, they fell. The walkers broke like hoarfrost under a boot heel. The weft of cold that the night had laid over Winterfell lifted, as if it had been trousered by a tailor who suddenly remembered he had cheated and was ashamed. Viserion screamed. It was a sound from a deep room no one should ever hear. The blue in him evacuated as if it had all along hated its quarters. Light flared and went out and left the dragon heavy and sick. He collapsed in the yard with a thud that broke tiles into new mosaics. He did not move. If any piece of his old self remained, it was too tired to say so. Arya dropped to the snow on her knees. Her breath tore in and out like paper. The hand she had used to stab shook and then did not. She turned and looked up into Bran's face. And for a second she was a small girl asking if what she had just done would have consequences. Bran, with his strange steady mouth, smiled. It was no wider than a knife blade and warmer than summer. Theon lay with his face sideways on the snow and one eye clogged with melt. He was still enough that a man could mistake him for dead. Then his mouth moved and made the shape of home, without any sound, and he let his breath go out and did not ask it back. One of his men knelt and put his forehead to Theon's shoulder and did not care how it looked. Jon had no tears in the body he wore. He had not many in the one on the ground. He swallowed hard into the place where a sob would have been and held both selves together with a stitch that wanted to break when pulled. Rhaegal's breath shuddered, and the great head lowered until it touched the snow. Steam rose from the wide nostrils with the copper smell of blood under it. Dany brought Drogon down in the Godswood and slid from his neck with the gracelessness of exhaustion only saved from ugliness by relief. She stepped once and nearly fell, caught herself on the curve of a root. Her eyes found Jon where he sat inside a beast. She put her hand on Rhaegal's muzzle, just behind the nostril, in that softer place where scales give a little. "Come back," she said. It was almost an apology for asking. There was now nothing to hold the sky but the stars. The storm, cheated of the conclusion it had been promised, sagged and sulked and began to move on. It was not gone. Winter is stubborn. But the sharpness had been blunted. The air tasted less like iron and more like old snow. Jon let go in slow inches. If he had torn himself free, he suspected, he would have left the better parts of himself on those teeth and in those bones. He retreated the way a man withdraws from the bedside of someone he loves who is sleeping, redundantly careful, unwilling to make a noise that will steal even a second of that person's rest. Rhaegal leaned his head into Dany's palm as Jon's presence withdrew, as if the dragon wanted to make it easier for the man who had shared his lungs to leave. The last bit was a pop like a cork, and then Jon was a man in his own battered body again, with eyes that had purposes only men remember. He sucked air that was suddenly stupidly heavy. He coughed and rolled to his side and heaved the remnants of bile and a thin skiff of blood from a throat that had been too long forgotten. Sam's hands were on him, warm and shaking, one at the back of his neck the way his father's had been when he had been small and too proud to admit fever. Davos swore with heartfelt artistry and then laughed wetly and told him he looked like hammered shit. Jon tried to answer and made something that was half a laugh and half a sob and precisely good enough. He stood with help. His legs did not remember the manners of gravity immediately. They learned quickly enough. He took 3 steps and the room turned once round him and then held still. The door had been barred and then opened and then barred again by men who had not asked if they should and had needed to be told none of this. He appreciated the common sense to do all 3 at ridiculous speed. "How long?" he asked, and the words were rusty. "Long enough," Davos said. "And then a bit more." He put a hand on Jon's back and steered him without suggestion toward the Godswood because there was nowhere else Jon would accept. They crossed the yard that had a new dragon-shaped scar in it. Men underfoot were groaning and laughing and retching and lying very still. A mule with the sense God gave beasts stood with its ears cocked and did not panic because no one had told it to. A woman Jon did not know sat on a barrel and wept with the neat economy of someone who had been taught not to be untidy even in grief. Sam matched Jon's steps though his legs were shaking. "You were gone," he said quietly, not accusing. "A long time. I thought I should slap you." He looked as if he were seeking permission in retrospect. "You did?" Jon asked. Sam colored. "I might have. Once." "Good." Jon clapped his friend's shoulder. The touch hurt his own wounds and he accepted the sting as proof he was home where pain is honest. In the Godswood, the air smelled very briefly of spring. It was an illusion made by the heart tree's relief. The red leaves shook in a wind that was only their own shiver. Snow lay in bruised patches where footsteps had made the ground angry. The dead lay in pieces that refused further duty. The living stood in knots or alone, counting absences the way merchants count coin when the moneylender is coming tomorrow. Dany stood with a hand on Rhaegal and another on Drogon, one left and one right, as if she were a hinge between 2 old doors. Her eyes found Jon as he came under the branches. She did not smile. She did not move toward him. He understood. There would be time for people later or there would not be. Either way, there was now the matter of drawing breath and acknowledging those who could no longer do so. Arya sat with her back against a root. She had her knees up and her arms around them for a child's warmth she no longer required. Her eyes were blank not from shock but because she had put them away for safekeeping. When she saw Jon, she stood in one uncoiling that made no fuss of the blood on her collar. He went to her and stopped with a distance between them that had never been there when they were small and which honor had since learned to respect. She bridged it with a step and a press of her forehead to his chest that lasted only the time necessary to transfer a little heat. When she left him, his shirt was damp with a place that had not been snow. Bran rested in his chair with his eyes half closed. He looked less like a prince than like a stone that happens to hold the shape of a boy. The roots under his wheels had pushed up through thin soil as if eager to keep him from sinking. Jon crouched despite the pull in his wounds and the protest in his muscles and put his hands on the arms of the chair the way he had before. "You brought me back," he said. Bran shook his head minutely. "You came back. I held a door while you did it. Then thank you for the door." Bran's mouth twitched in the way his father's had when pleased and unwilling to make display. "You were very large for it," the hinges complained. Jon huffed a laugh despite blood in his nose and a stitch in his side like a nail. "I'll be smaller next time." Bran's eyes flicked to the branches and then down to Jon again. "Do not be smaller," he said, with a sudden clarity that showed how much he was elsewhere most hours. "Be more." Theon lay a little way off with men kneeling over him. Jon went to him and knelt too and laid fingers on the cold skin of his forehead. He had no words for boys who had loved the wrong things and learned too late how to love the right ones. He had only the breath he could give to each of their names. He gave Theon's. The Ironborn murmured something sweet and filthy and appropriate. Davos turned away and scrubbed at his eyes as if smoke had irritated them. Sam pressed his lips together and made that small noise men make when allowing grief through a narrow door it barely fits. Rhaegal lifted his head and huffed. The breath smelled like a riverbank at noon in summer. Drogon answered with a rumble that said the work had been good, and he was ready to sleep and would permit no one to argue. Dany closed her eyes and let her shoulders drop for the first time since the storm had started purposefully. She opened them again, perhaps by habit, perhaps because queens do not get to close anything for long. Not eyes and not doors and not wounds if it can be helped. "Viserion," Jon said, and Dany's mouth tightened and then eased as if she had decided the name would not break her when spoken. She looked past him to where the white dragon lay in the yard like a ruin that had been beautiful and might be again or might not. "He is quiet," she said. "I do not know what that means." "Quiet is better than the wrong song," Jon said, and they both looked at the yard where men were walking up to the vast stillness with the careful bravery people bring to sacred things. No one touched. One Dothraki walked a slow circle around the corpse and muttered into his beard. An unsullied officer counted wounds as if wounds were a ledger and tea. Allaying them would pay something off. On the wall, torches guttered lower and then caught on oil that had not yet frozen. The wind went about collecting loose bits of cloth and dropped them again when bored. Somewhere in the keep a woman's cry rose and fell and rose, and it was not grief but childbirth, because life keeps its own odd schedule and does not consult with war. A boy laughed once with a hysterical edge and was slapped gently by someone who loved him. The slap was a mercy. He sobbed and then smiled, humiliated and grateful in the same breath. Sansa came from the direction of the crypts with dust in her hair and her trudging calm wearing scuffs. Tyrion was at her shoulder, and Missandei a step behind, and Varys a little to the side like a steward making himself useful by being spared the need to fight. Gilly followed with little Sam bundled against her chest and her chin set like a door propped with a bar. Their faces were the faces of people who have been to the other side of a thought and returned with proof there is another side. Sansa took in the godswood with a single glance that made inventory and set it aside for an hour later when everyone would want to say names and count spoons and notice which walls leaked and which did not. She looked at Arya, and Tyrion looked at Arya, and even Varys looked at Arya, and no one said anything because there is nothing to be said that will make such moments behave. They only looked, and the looking was a kind of song. The wind turned. It came briefly from the east where the sea is, and with it came a taste of salt that could only be imagined but which a man from Winterfell could imagine easily if he had been north a long time and longed now for something that moved under light instead of colored it. Jon breathed that imagined salt in and let it sit in him alongside the smoke and the iron and the cold. He stood straighter. He did not feel well. He felt instead present. The night did not end. It grew thinner. It changed shades from iron to charcoal like a bruise fading. Men crawled from snow like moles and stretched like cats and swore to anyone who would listen that they had never in all their lives meant to live so long. Fires were fed with planks that had once been benches, with chairs that had belonged to no one's grandfather in particular, with a section of fence that had pleased someone for years and would now please no one but warmth. The cooks took stock. The healers, those with training and those without who were willing, walked the yard and the hall and the little places between with strips of linen and needles and mulled wine that did more good for the soul than for the wound. Men went into the godswood to see the place where the world had not ended. They took off their hats or they did not, depending on how their mothers had taught them, and they spoke under their breath. Arya slipped away along the wall and no one stopped her. Sansa went to the castle proper with Tyrion and made lists that would later read as if written by someone calm and rested. Dany checked her dragon's injuries like a groom and then like a mother and then like a general who must know assets to plan for Dawn. Jon sat on a fallen branch because it was lower than the bench that had survived and somehow he could not make himself sit on anything that had never been knocked loose. Ghost came and pressed his weight against Jon's knee. The pressure hurt in a way that pleased some ill-disciplined part of him. He put his hand into the fur and found the line where blood had matted it and the line where it had dried and stuck to his fingers. "Good boy," he said, the oldest prayer he knew. He looked at Bran and saw the boy's gaze turned outward and inward both. "It isn't over," Bran said a little later, and the matter-of-factness in it made the words a floor rather than a fall. "No," Jon said. The word left his lips smoky and tired. "It isn't. The cold that walked had a maker," Bran continued, which was a thing older people in the north had always known and had mostly decided not to think about. "I thought the children," Jon stopped. He remembered the tree's voice and decided he did not know and would not pretend. "What do we have, then?" "Time," Bran said. "A thin slice of it. And choices." Jon nodded. He had never been rich in either. The thin slice of time felt like a luxury and a humiliation in one. He looked at Dany and her dragons and at his sisters and at the men who had come to him from the wall and from beyond it and from the south under banners that still felt peculiar in this snow. He thought of a spear cast at an angle only a dragon can make true and of a knife that had been named for things he did not love and had nevertheless been the right shape for this night. He thought of a girl who had learned to be small and then learned to be all the sizes men needed her to be to pass by her and not see her until it was too late. "Eat," Davos said from a little way off, practical as table salt. "You'll be no good as a hero if you fall over when the queen looks." Jon took the bowl that Sam pushed into his hands. It was thin stew and good. He burned his tongue and didn't mind. He swallowed and the heat went down and made a place in him that was not dark. He sat under the red leaves that had watched wolves and men and dragons and something older than dragons make new arrangements. He listened to the wind find old songs and play them wrong for a while and then better. He put his hand on Ghost and Ghost put his head heavier. He looked at the sky through the holes in the storm and saw one star and thought, stupidly and rightly, that perhaps this would do for now. He slept without meaning to and woke with the dawn easing in like a careful guest. He woke to the sound of men moving in ways that did not cut and to the quiet of too many who would never move again. He woke with pain as a companion and found he did not hate it. He woke with the taste of fire still on his tongue, of a cold that had wanted to be forever, of a tree that had told snow to fall, of a girl's knife working the last inch. He woke with the knowledge that to be a man and a dragon and a son and a brother and a lover and a king of anything worth saving would require being more than any one of those words had room for. He stood and the world did not end when he did so. That was not nothing. He went to work in a morning that did not belong to the dead. He spoke names. He considered maps. He listened to people who had things to say he did not wish to hear. He took off his glove and laid his palm on a dragon's neck and felt the great pulse there like a river and said thank you without making it a command. He found Dany and stood with her where the wall had blown down and now let the sun in. They watched men carry stones and men carry men. They watched children open their eyes who had learned the size of the world too young. They watched a raven settle in the heart tree and make a sound like a hinge relieved of weight. "You were gone," she said after a while. The words as neutral as any a queen has ever said when what she means is something not neutral at all. "I was," he said. He did not apologize. He did not justify. He did not tell her the view from above had made him ache for the simplicity of not being human. He did not tell her he had missed being a man the way the sea misses the moon. He looked at her and the bruise blossoming along her jaw and the cracks in her lips and the way she stood in fatigue that would have put any nobleman of King's Landing to bed for a week, and he felt something like loyalty refine itself inside him as a smith refines iron until it will take a better edge. "Will you do it again?" she asked. There was no judgment in it, only planning. "If I must," he said. It was the only true answer. She nodded as if she had expected it and was relieved anyway. "Then we must make it so you do not have to," she said. Her eyes went to the south, where kings know their business waits when ice does not. He thought of Cersei's smile and the way men break when they try to walk long distances under that particular sun. He thought of food and ships and the kind of politics no sword cuts clean. He thought of Winterfell's dead laid out in rows and of letters that would have to be written with hands that shook. He thought of the ghost of blue that might still be walking somewhere thin and patient, inventing its return. He felt the tree behind him, the weight of the old in the spine of the world, not like chains, but like ribs, the structure without which the soft things collapse. He felt ghost press against his knee, a weight that always told true. He felt Rhaegal's breath a slow bellows, and Drogon's a deeper furnace, and the absence where Viserion lay too still. "Time," Bran had said. "Choices." He made one and did not say it aloud because saying has power and he wanted to shape it better before offering it to the world. He turned to the work of the morning that would become the labor of the day that would become the weight of the week that would become the story of a season, and his breath fogged and then did not, and he thought, not without humor. It will never be simple. Good. Simplicity is for those who never loved anything that could be taken. The old god's tree stirred, and a red leaf tore and drifted, and Jon watched it spin and land and keep its shape under a heel that did not step on it. Because even in Winterfell in a morning after a night like that, there is room for a man to put his foot down where he will do no harm if he cares to look. He looked. He moved. The day began again.